Okay, so let's try this one. It's working most probably, and I think more people will join in the future. Mm, okay, so let's just get started with and try and wrap this up within the next 45 minutes. So let's keep that as the target. Sorry, it's stretching coffee. Okay, so I think I had covered the basics of what United States and why and how United States is the most powerful country. Or just to summarize their economic significance, the kind of companies that United States has control over have are conducting business across the world, which makes other nations dependent on them. The third reason is their military, which means that the $600 billion military investment, which is more than others, their military bases established across the world, the military technology that United States is superior in, and how they've historically been involved in multiple global conflicts. All of these are reasons why United States is the most powerful nation in the world right now. And at the same time, other nations tend to comply with the United States in the event that there is a conflict between them and the others. Even India, which was a long time Iranian ally, eventually started decreasing oil imports from Iran just because there were problems there. So now let's just come to the different policies that the United States has taken in geopolitics over time and how do they differ from each other. So the first one that I was talking about was isolationism. It's the policy that entails that the United States should not be involved in global conflicts and they should minimize their involvement in helping slash aiding other nations. The reason behind that is one, a lot of people feel culpable for the damage and destruction which is caused in the other nations when you are involved in that kind of a conflict. Or the second reason behind that is second reason behind that is the economic cost of the war. Also, United States has military drafting in many instances, like in case of Vietnam, which a lot of people dislike. So there are many reasons why USA would want to become isolationist, as it did in the period just after the First World War. And the rationale behind that at that time was that United States should not be involved in the European conflicts because that damages the United States and their economies as well. And that is something that United States had been holding on to for all those years until the Second World War. In fact, also a few years into the Second World War. The second stance that United States and the politicians there often tend to take, and the one which had been predominant since the United States got involved in world order and to establish and empower international institutions. This was something that was started when Roosevelt decided to finally enter the war directly against Japan. And and this started with an attack on Pearl Harbor, after which the United States declared a war on Japan, and as a result of which Germany declared a war on the United States. After which United States inevitably entered the global conflict and has stayed and maintained its role in world politics to date. So it started with, of course, victory in the Second World War, but also in 1943 when Franklin Roosevelt met Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill to, to talk about and establish the New World Order. The primary objective was to create a world in which the amount of conflict that happens gets considerably reduced and differences can be resolved through peaceful means. And that became the underlying principle behind American internationalist policies. It is this internationalist phase of the American politics which really led to people. It's the American phase of okay, sorry, I got distracted. Which really led to people forming those global international institutions. Examples of this institution include the International Monetary Fund, which is responsible for maintaining monetary stability across the world, allowing nations to cope with balance of payments crisis, and something I'll discuss in the later part. It also includes institutions like the World Bank, in which is aimed at eliminating poverty by giving grants and loans at lower interest rates to a number of other countries. They also were a part of something called the Marshall Plan, which was meant to reconstruct Europe. And it was also a part of the Truman Doctrine, which was to contain the Soviet Union. I think all of these are examples where United States was internationalist, where they were trying to actively influence and manage the world order. And United Nations and USA being a part of it was a part of this internationalist policies. One step ahead of this internationalism is something called neoconservatism. So, what do we mean by neoconservatives? So, neoconservatives also believe in internationalism, which means they also believe that the United States should actively intervene in the world affairs. But the difference is that, as opposed to the aim of maintaining global peace, they believed that the United States should actively involve itself in conflicts to maintain democracy and to overthrow autocratic regimes. The neoconservative view of thought peaked in the United States under the age of during the period when George Bush II was president. Bush Jr.'s tenure, things like invasion to Iraq was broadly driven by neoconservatives like John Bolton, and the neoconservative influence in US politics since then has declined. So what neoconservatives advocate is often violent overthrowing of various regimes. For example, John Bolton also publicly stated that he would want Iranian regime to be overthrown by the United States. And I think all of these are examples of neoconservative policies being in place, whereas Obama signing the Paris Climate Accord is an example of internationalist policies in place. So I think what happened? So where does Trump really stand on this? So if you look at Trump's policies, they are primarily isolationist in nature. For example, raising tariffs, decreasing global trade, or condemning other countries and trying to undermine the NATO by asking other countries to pay more, or withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. These are all isolationist in nature, but at the same time, they aren't neoconservative either. So they are broadly they broadly qualify as a tilt towards isolationism. One of the drawbacks of the United States and any of these US policies is the inconsistency in policies that comes in any democracy for that matter, because subsequent governments have different policies, and each of them and the next government often tries to tweak those policies, and that often has had disastrous consequences for US influence across the globe. For example, uh, the Bay of Pigs invasion was something that President Dwight Eisenhower, from I think from the Republican Party, I'm not sure which party, I think Republican, wanted. So he wanted a violent overthrow of the Cuban regime. But when John F. Kennedy came to power, he significantly scaled back American support to the Bay of Pigs invasion, as a result of which it became a massive failure. We have also seen something like this happen recently in the instance of the Iran nuclear deal, where Barack Obama had that negotiated and Donald Trump had that scrapped. So these inconsistencies in policies, while cause some problems, also lead to are just an inevitable part of the democratic system in which the United States is based. So just to summarize, the United States, it's a leading superpower. It has significant economic importance, cannot be really replaced. Largest military, can influence geopolitical affairs, or has historically done so under the policy of containment, but at the same time continues to do so either if international relations have to be strengthened, or for any other legitimate reason that the then government feels exists. For example, weapons of mass destruction, or the suspicion of such weapons existing in Iraq, or the Iranian regime change that a lot of people today are advocating. Sorry. Uh, but the downside of all these different policies is that they are often inconsistent because of subsequent governments can have different viewpoints. Some of them could be more isolationist, some could be more internationalist, some could be neoconservative, or anything, or a mix of all of these, because there aren't any fixed policies per se in this. So I'll wait for 1 minute or so in case you have any questions on that. Okay. So no questions on the United States. So let's just proceed. If you have any questions, then I'll just stop and answer your questions. So let's just move on to China and the significance of China in geopolitical trade. Okay, there's a question. How is retracting from Paris Accord a form of internationalism? Or no, retracting from Paris Accord is an example of isolationism, but being a part of it, which was under the previous governments, was more internationalist in nature. So internationalism is broadly forming or being a part of global institutions or empowering global institutions, as opposed to prioritizing United States in particular. Okay. So let's just move on to China and why is it that China today is increasingly relevant? Okay, there's another. Did the neoconservative ideology in the United States during this period actually bring any kind of stability in any conflict? Oh, in some instances, the results were promising because, for instance, the victory in Iraq was really swift, but at the same time, it didn't quite bring the stability that was desired. But the reason behind that isn't strictly the failure of neoconservatism per se, but the inconsistencies in policies following the Bush period, because US funding to redevelop Iraq and reconstruct in the reconstruction process decreased significantly when the regime in the United States changed. So there is an element of inconsistency in policies. There's also an element of change in public sentiments during that period. So yeah, you can't say that the ideology really led to something, but something regarding the stabilities, because it was really uh, on only for a few people for some time, and also because the subsequent presidents didn't carry it forward. So we can't conclusively say that it was the main cause for these problems. But in retrospect, we can say that USA shouldn't have invaded Iraq, because the whole destruction of Iraq then wouldn't have happened. Or one could argue that USA should have stayed there longer and ensured that at least the reconstruction process is completed. I think either of these can be argued in a debate, but either of these are an active debate of which of these was like a good thing to do. And I think even George Bush acknowledged that he shouldn't have invaded Iraq. So I think that's saying something. When USA tried to curb communism by creating instability, how is it internationalism? It's about the manner in which United States did that. For example, In Korea, it wasn't USA alone fighting the war. It was USA as well as the joint United Nations forces which were a part of it. Similarly, what qualifies as internationalism is also USA trying to prevent the spread of communism because of the view that communism is bad for people. Is it necessarily bad is a different debate altogether. But yeah, so it's just an example of USA following the policy of containment. And the reason why that qualifies as internationalism is because the USA performed these actions under the name of protecting all the other capitalistic institutions that existed during that period. And Vietnam War is an example of a similar scenario in which USA wanted to contain the spread of communism into South Vietnam, as a result of which they supported President Diem in Vietnam. And supporting President Diem during that period meant that there is instability in the country itself, but you're also protecting other countries like Laos, Cambodia, India, etc., from falling into the communist hands during that period. Is neoconservatism a form of internationalism? Or, like I also mentioned in the work before this, that yes, neoconservatism includes the tenets of internationalism, but they are more hawkish in their foreign policies in terms of how you should be intervening. So it's about USA imposing democracies in other nations by overthrowing autocratic regimes. The hawkishness characterizes neoconservatism, or has characterized neoconservatism in the historical context. So, yeah, that's broadly the context on the United States. So let's just move on to, yeah, what benefit did USA as a country achieve in trying to restore achieve democracy in autocratic regimes? Individualistic benefit क्या है उनका? One, I think it's not driven by the individualistic benefit of the United States as much as it is driven by the desire to free other people from autocratic regimes, and that it is a responsibility of the United States to do so because the public sentiment demands the same. So that's broadly why they did, and the immediate objectives were also objective of wanting oil, uh, also to examine uh, whether they really do have weapons of mass destruction. So I think there were a combination of reasons, but a purely neoconservative standpoint is primarily driven by the duty of the United States to impose democracies in other nations. That being the obligation, given that you have the privilege of being a powerful nation. So, in a pure neoconservative view, it's not self-interested, but rather obligatory. So let's move on to China now, and I'll clarify the subsequent doubts after this. So, China, in terms of politics, first, how did China become the nation that it is today? Oh, it is an authoritarian single party democracy, but even in its own policies, it has evolved over time. Let's start with Mao because I think that's where our history is. That's from where a significant history starts. After winning the Chinese Civil War against Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong established what we call a totalitarian form of rule. What are the qualities of a totalitarian rule? A totalitarian rule often includes a cult of personality around a leader who is worshipped like God with blind following, and whose criticism is completely repressed in the country. At the same time, the leader's viewpoints are the ones which are imposed. The viewpoints of this leader happen to be Marxist in nature, which means that creation of communes, etc., an abolition of private property, people being sent away to work in fields and communes and were allotted a certain share of food in exchange. Or over time, after Mao's death, China evolved into becoming an authoritarian regime, but not a totalitarian one. What does that mean? It means the cult of personality was dismantled, and the party system became a lot more meritocratic in nature. So this happened during the period of Deng Xiaoping, who was not the president of the Communist Party, but was as good as a dictator in China. at that time because of the influence that he had, even without holding any political positions there. He made some a few critical reforms in the Chinese system. First, it created a presidential term limits, which means that a president could only be a member for a few years, 2 terms basically, beyond which you're not eligible for being re-elected by the party officials. The second was a form of collective leadership where instead of giving too much power to one person, it was distributed across different party officials who were given sufficient autonomy within their respective domains to do whatever they want. And thirdly, they made the Communist Party system incredibly meritocratic in nature, which means that if you perform very well as an official at a local level, you can easily climb to the top. And these were the reforms which, once enacted in 1979, helped China to grow and prosper economically. During this period, China was protectionist. China had managed capitalistic systems. They established special economic zones and they heavily regulated these companies. What they were able to achieve and why the economic and heavily able to regulate companies and what they were able to achieve out of this was emancipation from poverty and a strong economy. To illustrate how strong Chinese economy became because of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, the poverty rate of China in the year 1990 was 60%, 66 around, like around 60%. In the year 2017, the poverty rate was around 5%, according to the UNDP report. The way they were able to do it was things like protectionism, special economic zones, but also questionable policies like intellectual property theft and protectionist policies, or other like policies that violated intellectual property by mandating companies to share their intellectual property if they want to access the Chinese market. All of these policies, while controversial, undoubtedly helped China lift itself up on a global scale to the extent that today China is trading and trying to help Chinese companies enter into other developing countries, because of which China is now facing problems because of their own policies that they enacted during the previous period. So all the policies like intellectual property theft are things that China has started discouraging simply because now it's their own companies whose intellectual properties need to be protected, and now they are the ones entering other countries. So you don't want Africa to become China's China, basically. To that extent, uh, the Deng Xiaoping reforms significantly emancipated the Chinese and reduced. Okay, so the question is, what is intellectual property? Intellectual property is things like patents or technologies which you are not allowed to replicate, but to help the inventor or create incentive for people to innovate. Because if I innovate and if everybody else can simply use my innovation without me being benefited, then that technology is not good. For example, if I create a new drug, but if everybody can now just use that formula and create their own drugs, then I have no incentive to create new drugs to solve new diseases in the first place. So you create something called a patent, which prevents other companies from legally using it for a certain number of years. But because Chinese companies were not as technologically sophisticated back in those years, intellectual property theft was very common among Chinese companies. They would reverse engineer existing technologies to help their own companies develop significantly. What this ended up achieving for China is it helped create the Chinese tech giants in the long term. Uh, because of the technological development and technological know-how which was shared by the incoming companies, or which was taken or taken by China by questionable means. Are these policies morally wrong? Is definitely up for debate, because if the end goal is to lift billions of people out of poverty, then it does make sense to improvise this. Whereas some people can also oppose this on the grounds that innovation can be discouraged, and that today China will also need the same intellectual property protections that they had been flouting for so long, because now it's the Chinese companies who are also innovating out there. So is there a need to change the way China approaches geopolitics or like the way they approach international trade, definitely. But at the same time, there are important political changes happening in China as well, which I'll talk about. But before that, uh, so today, some of the major Chinese companies include companies like Tencent, like Alibaba, Weibo is like an app equivalent of a WhatsApp plus Facebook for the Chinese people, and it's also acquiring companies across the globe. One of the key ways in which Chinese companies differ from the American ones while entering new markets is American companies use Indianized versions of their own brands to really provide services in Indian countries. For example, you have a Google India for India. On the other hand, the Chinese companies generally have a tendency to acquire already existing indigenous companies and fund those companies as opposed to directly entering the market as a Chinese giant. An example of this could be the 20% stake that I think Tencent or one of the Chinese companies has in Paytm. Uh, and this is a trend that even the American companies are starting to follow. An example of that is when Walmart acquired Flipkart, but it's primarily a Chinese trend. For example, Tencent acquires various similar services in countries like Singapore, like Vietnam. And I think that there are two different approaches, but they have their own merits and demerits. But of course, that's up to debate. Just to summarize this part, it's authoritarian, but it shifted from a totalitarian system to an authoritarian system through various reforms which were conducted by Deng Xiaoping. And what that led to eventually was emancipation, like significant decline in the poverty rate in the country. So today, China is significantly more influential. And let's talk about the kind of influence that they hold. First is the Belt and Road Initiative that they have undertaken, which is financing infrastructure in other countries at marginal or extremely low interest rates and with minimal preconditions. And why do smaller countries often take this? Because it's a source of easy funding for the development of all of these. And because there is a requirement for capital in all of these countries, uh, they readily take it. Another objective of Belt and Road is also to promote cultural exchange, which is significantly beneficial. Our companies operated seen differently in a communist country. Oh, it is different in the sense that uh, corporations in China often need to have some allegiance to the party. For example, Jack Ma also said that he's a member of the Communist Party, or he claims to be so. And it's the party officials who generally tend to have more influence. So if you're closer to an authoritarian regime, uh, that works. Is criticism allowed in authoritarian regimes? In China, criticism is allowed. You can discuss issues and problems that you're facing, and officials try to compete with each other to make sure that their location is best satisfied. So yeah, China does allow a certain degree of criticism, but as you will see later in Russia, the same criticism is not allowed. So yeah, let's start with the Belt and Road Initiative then. The main objective of the Belt and Road Initiative is easy movement of goods, expansion of Chinese companies, but at the same time, it also has an underlying political objective, which is to gain influence over these countries. When China becomes an important source of your funding, you cannot really say no to any other demands that China makes. But it also allows China to seize control of various assets. For example, when Sri Lanka was not able to pay their debt, they had to lease the port to China for 99 years, which gave China control over a port which surrounds one of their rivals that India is. So it also serves a geopolitical interest where Chinese influence can be, or Chinese sphere of influence can be created. But the primary means of doing that is economic in nature, because you make other countries economically reliant on you for funding. But broadly, it's also a source of funding for other countries and a source of development. So is it really developing countries? Or the results are mixed. For example, you have heavy investment in various highways in Pakistan, which haven't really yielded any returns because people don't use those highways at all. Whereas there are other investments which have given a certain degree of return. But at the same time, uh, more and more countries are attracted to Chinese investments because they feel that either the International Monetary Fund charges a very high interest rate, or that the lending is not done because the country is a dictatorship. And given that China doesn't care about these things, they are very likely to get into this. Secondly, China is gaining a significant influence over the African countries. And why is that the case? Because African countries, while they are war torn, they also need easy loans, and they need loans with low interest rates. So, one of the attempts that China is making is to invest in African countries to make sure that Chinese companies get business when the African nations develop. The flip side is that this also brings those countries under the Chinese sphere of influence. So, how should the world combat China? I think that's a subject of ongoing debates. It can be, some people are discussing sanctions on all the countries who take that kind of help. It could be lending to these countries at much cheaper rates, but there is no consensus per se about how you should be doing it. So these are the economic strengths that China really has in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of the low poverty rates that they were able to achieve, and also in terms of the influence that they have over other countries because of the strong economic power and because of the innovation that the Chinese companies have been recently able to make. They are also one of the leaders in artificial intelligence and have developed strong techniques, like strong patented technologies that can do so. The flip side is that they're also using that to monitor their population. But yeah, so it has different issues with it as well. But broadly, while Chinese policies have helped it to reach this stage, significant changes in their policies will be required in the future. Now let's look at the downsides and the challenges that China is facing. First is that China is regressing again into the kind of totalitarian rule that existed before Deng Xiaoping. So, the current Chinese president has abolished the presidential term limits with the parliamentary support, which means that the checks that existed no longer exist on the president. Second, a cult of personality has been created around Xi Jinping, which means that uh, people do sort of worship him in the Chinese uh, cities and Chinese rural areas, and he is taught in schools while Deng Xiaoping is gradually being erased from Chinese histories and Chinese memories. The purpose behind that is to create that cult of personality and to entrench Xi Jinping's power in the Chinese Communist Party. So one, it is regressing increasingly in the direction of totalitarianism once again from the meritocratic party system that the reforms under Deng Xiaoping were able to establish. The second problem that China faces today is their debt. Their debt is around 350% of their GDP. And the reason behind that is that Chinese have massively invested in infrastructure during the global financial crisis. The reason behind that investment is primarily to create jobs, because when people have jobs they are able to spend, and if they're able to spend then businesses can continue to make profits and employ more people. So to balance the effects of loss in international trade, they had to take more loans and more debt from the public and fund their businesses and fund infrastructure during that period. Another point of vulnerability that Chinese have is that of export dependency, which means that the Chinese government is Chinese economy is heavily dependent on exports and trade surpluses. So when Donald Trump started a trade war with China, the American economy wasn't significantly hurt. In fact, during the trade war, America's inflation and unemployment both were at an all-time low, while the Chinese economic growth slowed down significantly. Uh, the reason behind that slowdown is first is of course the how dependent China was on its exports, but also because USA has more economic power to really slow China down. The youth unemployment in China reached like a 40-year high during that period, and broadly, China was trying to stop the trade war, whereas Donald Trump was trying to negotiate benefits out of it. So that helped, significantly helped China become weaker and significantly led to China becoming a slower growing economy during that period. So that's another point of vulnerability that they have. However, they also have a strong lobbying power because of the Chinese companies. For example, they have lobbies in Russia, they have lobbies in European Union. So that broadly covers the economics of China. Uh, and I'll try and share some articles on the Chinese economic model so that you guys will have more context about the things that I just mentioned. But broadly, just to summarize the economics of China, one, they created special economic zones. They allowed companies to exist. They privatized a lot of companies and they regulated these corporations, which helped them emancipate a lot billions of people from poverty. Second, the Belt and Road Initiative means that China makes investments in other countries to increase their influence and also to help Chinese economy. Third, it invests in African countries to gain influence in those regions. Fourth, it's vulnerable because the debt is over three times their GDP, because their economy is export dependent, and all of these vulnerabilities were exposed during the US and China trade war. And also, finally, they have lobbies in Russia and the European Union. So that summarizes Chinese economy. Now let's just talk about how China is working internally and the internal issues that China faces today. First problem that China has internally is social control, because China is driven primarily by the concept of party supremacy, which means that things like social credit and like mass surveillance ensures that people are expected to behave in a manner that the party finds acceptable. It also allows the party to single out party dissenters and to keep itself in power. Second, they are building a cult of personality around Xi Jinping, which means that it's transitioning back into a totalitarian rule. Or you already have the Xi school of thought, and his name is already added to the constitution as well. All of these highlight a regression of China back into the old days of totalitarianism, while the difference between Xi and Mao continues to be that Xi Jinping also supports capitalistic systems and supports capitalistic entities. Third, the party is still meritocratic in nature. And finally, uh, persecution of Uyghur Muslims in China. There are millions of Uyghurs who have been detained in what is called re-education camps or re-education centers, where they are supposedly tortured. And initially, China reacted to this by denying, but eventually there were satellite images and also accounts of people who escaped those camps, and all of those accounts suggest that this happens. Uh, the party has a history of quashing dissent in this context. The 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, where people asking for more democratic rights were uh, killed by Chinese tanks, and many of them were arrested or deported and tortured and beaten. Uh, Today, Chinese textbooks don't mention it or mention it to a very small extent so as to erase this from the memories of the Chinese people. The person in charge of China in the year 1989, when the massacre happens, ironically, was Deng Xiaoping, who was also involved in the Chinese liberalization during the 1970s and 1980s, which helped China become the superpower, like or the challenger to the US hegemony that it has become today. So broadly, all these policies are clearly aimed at maintaining party supremacy in China, but they have also helped the Chinese people because the party has an incentive to keep the people happy, to ensure that their prosperity also takes place. But the party still remains mm, at the center of, or the interest of the party still remain at the center of their policies. So let's move on to the third country. But before that, any questions on China in particular? Oh, yeah. So to elaborate on the Chinese economic model, uh, it's not purely state driven because you have, so the way it works is you have corporations and smaller companies that the party supports. And while there are these corporations that the party supports, they, for them, all the rules and regulations are cleared very easily, or they are very easily able to achieve whatever permissions and regulations they want. And China ensures that these corporations become competitive against the global market. At the same time, it also allows foreign companies to come in so long as they adhere to whatever Chinese norms are. Uh, they also allow Chinese companies to trade with others, but at the same time, they are kept under strict surveillance from the top. Uh, isn't the US also in a lot of debt? The short answer is yes, but not as much as China is in. So in USA, the government debt to GDP is around 80%, but in China, it's more than three times. But at the same time, there are no official records, so there is no conclusive evidence for this. But according to a report by The Economist, the public debt was 350%. Is China unique in its brand of authoritarianism? I think all authoritarians are unique in their own ways, but China is one of the most successful authoritarian regimes if you measure it purely in terms of the economic growth that the people encountered in that period and the number of people who are lifted from poverty. In fact, just for reference, American poverty rate is 12%, but China's is around 4 to 5, according to the UNDP report. I'll see if I have that report. I'll try and share that with you guys. Now, so like we spent more time on the economics of China. So, in the context of Russia, we'll probably talk more about their politics. In theory, Russia is a multi party semi presidential system. It has a parliament called a Duma, and it also has elections. And it has a separate presidential election in which the president is elected, and there's a separate parliamentary election in which the prime minister is eventually appointed by the majority party. In practice, however, Russia is authoritarian for multiple reasons. One, the opposition is generally quashed in the election, so there are very few legitimate opposition parties. The media is broadly controlled by the state. The protests are brutally repressed, like we saw in the year 2012. There is significant dissemination of fake news, which means that the electorate is not very well informed, and there is systematic assassination of dissenting politicians who often try and die by accident. Uh, at the same time, Putin's popularity is significantly high. He was elected by almost 70% of the popular vote in the 2016 election. So that does give you a hint that there is something not right about the Russian democracy. Why does China have incentives to make people happy but not other authoritarian countries? Uh, the simple reason behind that is that they just chose to do that. So in China, you had different factions, or you had the Marxist conservative faction which wanted to continue like Mao's policies. There was a moderate faction and there was a radical faction. So in the political maneuvering that subsequently happened, uh, in fact, Deng Xiaoping was purged a couple of times from the party, but he eventually did succeed in the political maneuvering. And because the radical reformist faction eventually won out, they decided to go ahead with the reforms. So let's just say that the Chinese authorities just took better decisions uh, for this for in this direction because they were under good leadership at that point. And not all authoritarians are always under good leadership, and not all authoritarians have a strong incentive to reform their economies. But because Deng Xiaoping was uh, because Deng Xiaoping had already seen these kind of problems being faced, and because he was from the faction which advocated these kinds of reforms, he went ahead with those reforms once he became powerful and dominant in the party. Coming back to Russia, uh, so first the Russian elections. Uh, like we already spoke about, there's the opposition is fairly quashed, and the president is he has been in power since the year 1999, since 2000, in fact. So that should tell you something about the freedom, the political freedom that people in Russia have. Unlike China, Russia projects its the way Russia remains popular with the public is not through economic policies, but generally through their military adventures. What does that mean? It means that there are three systematic ways, systematic parts of Putin staying in power. The first is presenting the West as people who always meddle in the Eastern European conflicts or people who actively try to undermine the Russian Federation. Second, portraying himself as a strong man who can really uh, who can really like combat the Western influence. And also thirdly, by maintaining a strong personal, physically like a personal macho image, as a result of which people admire him as an individual and at the same time admire his policies because of the nationalism that he invokes in the people. So that's broadly how Putin remains popular among the public. And apart from this, of course, they don't quite have an alternative. For example, Alexei Navalny was arrested uh, before he could contest elections under false charges of corruption after I think something was planted in his house. So all of these are examples of how Russia really keeps itself in power. Another aspect of the Russian government is the oligarchy. The oligarchs are powerful businessmen who are linked to the government and who fund presidential campaigns. So these people generally own major businesses like Russia's oil business, etc. And they generally have significant influence in the Russian state. How did they come to become these wealthy businessmen? They came to become these wealthy businessmen after the fall of the Soviet Union, when uh, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when there was significant chaos, a lot of people were able to acquire property and become significantly rich. When Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation, became extremely unpopular, or he needed funding from other people. So he connected himself to the oligarchs, and the oligarchs effectively became powerful enough in his during his tenure. So what Vladimir Putin did was first he eliminated all the oligarchs who were against him and surrounded himself by a different set of oligarchs who are loyal to the Putin regime. So who has the upper hand between these? It's generally the Russian state, or given that historically Putin has in fact successfully eliminated oligarchs and arrested them whenever they seem to oppose the Putin regime. Now coming to the economics of Russia. Economically, Russia is heavily oil dependent, and they more than tripled their GDP during the Putin years, initial tenure by Vladimir Putin. Some people claim that it is broadly because the oil prices also went high during that period, because of which Russian economy soared, and others claim that Putin provided Russia with a stable government, which allowed Russia to make best use of oil. Uh, I think the answer is somewhere in between because stability in governance combined with high oil prices meant that Russia could make best use of those high prices to make itself economically powerful and make other countries economically dependent. So Russia provides oil to the European Union. It provides oil to countries like Ukraine, Belarus, etc. So that makes all of these countries increasingly dependent on Russian oil. And that gives Russia the negotiating power that it has. But at the same time, uh, the oil prices, when they tanked in 2014, that also caused a crisis in Russia. So both the factors come to play. But unlike China, Russia's economy is not as significant or as big to really challenge that of the United States. But their military is huge, and I'll talk about their military as well. So let's talk about briefly about the ruble crisis that Russia faced in the year 2014. The ruble crisis started when Russia annexed Crimea, and after they annexed Crimea, there were sanctions imposed and there were restrictions on imports, which made Russia increasingly dependent on China, but at the same time sparked a crisis. And at the same time, because Russian economy was heavily dependent on oil, and the oil prices also sank, that just doubled the problems that already existed. As a result, today the life expectancy of Russia is incredibly small. It's in the 50s or like early 60s, and its economic conditions are significantly weaker. But at the same time, recently they have also been growing economically. Its military is its military spending is the second largest in the world, while USA is 600 uh, it's $600 million in. Okay, wait, I'll just, yeah. It's because it's $600 billion. So Russia is only 60 billion. So it's almost one tenth of the United States. Uh, that being said, their military has been involved in various conflicts across the globe, generally in the Russian sphere of influence. For example, in Syria, in Ukraine, they've also been sending troops to Venezuela just in case there's a coup. They have sent troops in Georgia, which is just below Russia, and they have also used it to crush the Chechenian civil war. So all of these are examples of Russia asserting itself, but generally around their own sphere of influence, which is Russia and the countries, the former Soviet republics. Uh, One of the significant actions by the military was when they annexed Crimea from Ukraine, which sparked a global uproar and eventually led to Russia being sanctioned by all countries and cornered and removed from the G8. Uh, Coming to the next part, which is Russia's cyber warfare against other countries. They have been funding right wing populists, for example, the National Rally in France, which is the primary opposition party right now. Uh, they funded Viktor Yovanovitch from Ukraine. So there are multiple countries which have political parties linked to the Kremlin and are pro Kremlin as a result. At the same time, they have also interfered in foreign country elections, for example, in the United States, which got a significant amount of uh, criticism at the same time. And they also use fake news and targeted propaganda to disrupt other democracies. So, the reason behind all of these actions is to disrupt other countries and other democracies and to increase Russian influence and also project Russian power. So I think all of these are primary objectives of the Russian government, and because it is authoritarian in nature, these forms of projections often translate into ground level harms to democratic nations. Please talk about the IR of oil dependent economies significantly. How do oil prices play a role in their influence, and how do they further vested interest? So, oil dependent economies like Russia and the ones I'll talk after this have supply power to a large number of countries abroad. These countries are dependent on these oil imports because, in the absence of this, the oil prices will soar. That's the reason why, despite everything, Germany is still using Russian oil, and Donald Trump was not particularly happy about that. The reason behind that is that uh, keeping power and keeping energy cheap is important to remain popular in most of the places. And oil, in particular, is very important for most countries because all goods are transported using trucks which run on oil. An increase in oil prices leads to increase in the prices of all transported goods, which translates into inflation. and no government wants that kind of inflation. As a result, these countries have a significant influence over countries who import oil from others. But given that today there are multiple countries who have oil, uh, the influence of individual countries over time has decreased. For example, Saudi Arabia only supplies around 10 to 20% of global oil, as opposed to like a much larger number back in 1973 when they were able to impose the embargo. That being said, oil still is a very important resource in Russia, and primary income for Russia also comes from oil. So the dependence is both ways. And this two-way dependence also makes Russia vulnerable to other options existing. So if there are alternatives to the Russian pipelines that exist, it becomes difficult to then use Russian oil. And that makes it difficult for Russia to bully or exert their influence over other countries and their negotiating powers. So that's broadly the context under which Russia exists. Any questions on Russia in particular? Okay. How is the Russian military so developed with such a small funding? Oh, the reason behind that is that while China spends a huge portion of its public income or like its government money on infrastructure investment, Russia spends that amount of money on the Russian military. So while the amount or the money that Russia has is a lot, or resources that they have are a lot smaller, or a significantly larger portion of that goes into funding and maintaining its military. And that military, and the reason why that investment is worthwhile is because that keeps Russia influential, and other countries continue to use Russian resources like Russian oil. Doesn't it get the second highest funding globally? Oh, I'm not sure about that. That could be the case, but I'll still have to verify. Oh, does the military get the second highest funding? Yeah. The Russian military, like I mentioned, is Russia is the Russia spends around 60 uh, million or billion. I need to verify this, but Russia spends the second largest number of dollars on the military, United States being the largest, but the factor is 1 is to 10. So yeah, any other questions? Yeah, so Russia spends around 60 billion dollars, whereas United States spends around 600 billion dollars. So, but still, Russia is the second largest. USA is the largest in this. These were the numbers as of like a year ago, so I'm pretty sure the numbers could have changed a bit. What are the motives for Russia to be involved in the war in the Middle East if they have considerable amounts of oil? One, the kind of wars that Russia has been involved in are generally an act of projection of Russian power in the Russian sphere of influence. For example, in Syria, uh, Russia felt was that the rebellion in Syria was one, a threat to the Russian regime because that could spark rebellion in Russia as well. And second, they saw USA supporting the rebels as an act of interfering in the Russian sphere of influence. And that's the reason why Russia, by supporting the Syrian government, was able to project its power over the international against the international establishment, and that makes Putin extremely popular at home because that's what like China uses economics to keep its people happy. Russia uses nationalism and projection of power to keep Putin popular. Okay, now let's just move on to Saudi Arabia. Yeah, I heard recently that Saudi Arabia and Russia, yeah. So there's a price war going on currently between Russia and Saudi Arabia. Uh, Oil price war, because of which oil prices tanked briefly in the middle. Okay, let's just move on to Saudi Arabia because we are running out of time. So Saudi Arabia is primarily, of course, a monarchy, which means that there are. So think of Saudi Arabia as facing a three-way balance, right? So first, you have the Sunni clerics who give religious legitimacy to the monarchy. Second, you have the royal family. And third, you have the Saudi Arabian military. So the monarchy is based on collective decision making, and the princes and all lead a pretty lavish lifestyle there. And they are also seen as the leader of the Islamic world, partly because Mecca and Medina, both the important places in the Islamic religion, are specifically located in this in the geographical space of their territory. However, the trend of collective decision making is changing, and this balance is tilting under the new crown prince Mohammed bin Salman. And the reason behind that is the corruption crackdown. But before that, there are a few questions. Can you repeat how people in Russia view Putin, and why is his image comparatively better than other pseudo dictators? Oh, so there are multiple reasons behind that. Uh, the way Putin maintains his popularity is projection of Russian strength, and that has worked for years, given the state-controlled media, which keeps him popular and continues to inflate his image, and also because he's seen like riding a horse and like swimming and like going in those race cars, etc. So that macho image that he's maintained over the years, and also because he projects Russian strength, and Russian people uh, like this concept of nationalism because the previous leader Yeltsin was perceived as incredibly weak and creating a very weak image of what Russia truly is. So that kind of these kinds of gimmicks generally keep the Russian president incredibly popular, along with the fact that the media is controlled and there is practically no opposition. Of course, there have been protests in Russia, which means that there is a significant amount of political instability. But as long as he's able to maintain that balance between economics and some popularity, I think that works. Yeah. So now let's go to Saudi Arabia. So yeah, so the way the royal family works is very collective form of decision making, where the leader is appointed by the family after deliberation. This trend has recently seen a change since the crown prince Mohammed bin Salman began to consolidate power. And in the name of corruption crackdown, he's imprisoned a lot of rival princes who could be a challenge. And the previous crown prince Mohammed bin Naif was also uh, imprisoned, and he's fairly away from the public sight right now. The economics of Saudi Arabia is interesting. Of course, it's heavily oil dependent, and the main state owned company which harnesses this oil is called Saudi Aramco. And Saudi Aramco has the cheapest per barrel cost of extraction of oil in the world. So it's around 2 to $2.5 per barrel, vis-a-vis the global average of something around 6%, which makes the Aramco incredibly lucrative. and the oil is incredibly cheap, which makes it incredibly competitive as well. And in a world where uh, oil is gradually being replaced by renewables, the end of oil is gradually coming in sight, which means at least till 2050 oil will be relevant. But beyond that, it appears like gradually their importance will diminish is because of their contribution to global warming. And Saudi Arabia has an edge in this regard among all the oil producing nations. One, their oil is the cheapest, but secondly, their oil is also the cleanest, which means that the amount of pollution caused for extracting every barrel of oil is significantly lower, and that makes it really clean to extract oil from here. So while Venezuela has the largest oil deposits in the world, Saudi Arabia's are the cleanest and the cheapest at the same time. So tomorrow, when all oil gradually stops being used, Aramco's claim is that the last barrel of oil is going to come from Saudi Arabia. And this was the basis of setting an IPO, initial public offering, which means that Aramco, from being a government owned company, now becomes owned by private entrepreneurs and private shareholders. This is called an initial public offering. And the amount of money that people raised was the largest in the world for any initial public offering ever undertaken before this. The largest before that, Saudi Aramco raised around $35 billion, around 35 to $40 billion, by selling around something like 5% of its ownership. So that was one of the biggest innovations of that time. Is it buffering? In that case, I'll wait for some time. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So that being said, Saudi Arabia provides the cheapest and the cleanest oil, which is why USA is allied to it. And militarily, Saudi Arabia has also been involved in multiple global conflicts. For example, they supported the Syrian rebels. They supported the government of Yemen, President Hadi. They also funded different Sunni militias, and a lot of militias were funded by Saudi Arabia to go and fight wars in Afghanistan when the Soviet Union invaded it. These militants eventually formed groups like the Al Qaeda that Osama bin Laden founded, and also an offshoot of which then became the Islamic State. So, the primary Islamic sect in Saudi Arabia is Sunni, and the Sunni sect is predominant across most of the Middle East, barring Iran. Uh, US Saudi ties are primarily based on oil. It's based on the geopolitical influence that Saudi Arabia has because of its cheap oil, and also because USA wants to contain and counter Iran. And Saudi Arabia is the most powerful country to be able to do so. The problem with this also is that Saudi Arabia is using these weapons to commit war crimes in countries like Yemen, which is calling American policies into question. But the current American president is in favor of continuing the deal. Saudi Arabia also went into tremendous reforms under the new crown prince. For example, they allowed women to drive, etc. And these reforms and the crackdown on corruption, and these reforms were significant. And there was an expectation that Saudi Arabia is going to evolve over time. So that means, and yeah, and that it's also true that like USA imports, sorry, USA like sells a lot of arms to Saudi Arabia. Like I mentioned, American weapons were used in by Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen to commit various war crimes. So that's also right, as it's mentioned in the comments. Now, US Saudi ties broadly are based on these things. Uh, One of the recent setbacks in the Crown Prince's global image is the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in Turkey. Uh, Initially, Saudi Arabia denied that they had anything to do with it. First, they claimed that he left very easily, but eventually, like he left and like nothing quite happened. But eventually, they admitted that like he accidentally was killed and that the body was dismembered. Then they claimed that he was not accidentally killed, but he was killed by some rogue agents. So this inconsistencies in Saudi stances really did not create a good impression internationally, and it was even worse because there are evidences suggesting ties to the crown prince, who is said to have orchestrated this thing. Uh, that was a significant setback to all the deals that Saudi Arabia was trying to negotiate. But at the same time, it also shows how bad is the prince's policies can get. So yeah, the while the credibility of Saudi Arabia was significantly lost, it also halted a number of trade deals which Saudi Arabia was going to sign with a number of Western countries. And the Congress in USA was also appalled at what had happened because Jamal Khashoggi worked for an American newspaper called Washington Post and was critical of the Saudi monarchy. I think while the president is still in favor of the deal, overall the US Saudi relations also took a hit because of this reason, killing of Jamal Khashoggi. So that's broadly the context about Saudi Arabia. Uh, any specific question that you had about Saudi Arabia on this? Okay, so I'll just start with the last country that we are going to deal with. And I think we won't have time specifically for various international organizations, but I'm sure you can read up about that. So let's move on to Iran and what role does Iran play geopolitically today? Okay, before that, to what extent does it help viewing Islamic world as one large group, and who decides the global oil prices? So, and okay, there are more questions as well. Yeah. So let's answer the first question. Viewing the Islamic world today as one large group is probably not a good idea, particularly because, as you can already see, China um, persecuting Uyghur Muslims or Myanmar persecuting the Rohingyas. I think in none of these cases have the other countries singularly voiced their opinions. Secondly, the countries have also had disagreements among themselves. For example, when they blockaded Qatar, and at the same time, some of these countries have also developed strong ties with Israel, countries like Saudi Arabia, against Iran. So there is no coherent Islamic world anymore, but they do have the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So, and at the same time, you also have other regional blocks. For example, the Gulf states together have a collective to manufacture oil and negotiate oil prices. But none of this really makes them a single unit because there are multiple different backgrounds and contexts under which they exist. Who decides the global oil prices? Uh, so no one in particular anymore. So there was a time when Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states had a significant amount of power to really decide these prices. So when in 1973 United States supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, an oil embargo was imposed in the United States, which caused a significant amount of inflation in that country, going almost as high as 10 to 15%, which caused people to queue in front of stations, etc. So Saudi had a strong power. Oh yeah, so they are called GCC. Yeah, I'm so sorry, I forgot that name. Thanks, Nicholas. Uh, so it's called a GCC, and those are generally Gulf nations, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, etc., who manufacture oil and have significant so that they can collectively negotiate oil prices. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia is no longer the single manufacturer largest single manufacturer of oil, because United States, after the fracking boom, became the leader in manufacturing crude oil. But at the same time, Saudi Aramco remains the single largest corporation, because American fracking industry is very, very fragmented. So that gives Saudi Arabia a lot of negotiating power. But at the same time, today the global oil prices, because uh, Saudi no longer is the leader in oil manufacturing, is decided by a huge group of nations by collectively negotiating it in the open marketplace. Sometimes you have instances where Saudi Arabia and Russia have colluded together to raise the oil prices and decrease the oil production collectively. So that kind of changes with time. Today, because of global warming, what is clear is that eventually the demand for oil is going to globally go against going to globally decline. So the choice that Saudi has today is to either manufacture as much oil as possible to make revenues, or to hold oil and wait for the prices to rise, even though eventually you won't be able to sell the rest of the oil. So that's a trade-off that all oil producing governments need to make. And right now, the way Saudi decided to approach it is by privatizing Aramco and diversifying its economy away from oil. And is Russia a part of the GCC? No, not really. But Russia has often collaborated with the GCC to collectively raise the oil prices. And why Sunni majority countries always go against the Shia ones? There is no particular reason behind that except historical context. And I think that brings me to, because the Shia Sunni split, this is a reference to the Vokes video on the Gulf War, was not particularly violent historically, but uh, today it's become violent broadly because of geopolitics and how these countries have emerged over time. So that brings us to a final country, which is Iran, and the significance that Iran has in the global sphere. So first, Iranian government at one point was in fact elected. The first democratically elected leader of Iran was Mohammad Mossadegh, and he was a socialist. However, Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown by the United States during the policy of containment, and he was replaced by the Shah of Iran, called his name was Shah Reza Pahlavi. And the Shah of Iran was an autocrat, and he used military force to keep himself in power. The drawback of this was that he was extremely unpopular, and he was able to rule with an iron fist for around 40 years. But during those 40 years, he became incredibly unpopular, and people were not happy with his policies, which were often liberalization and westernization of Iran. What that led to is people eventually revolting against him and overthrowing the US backed Shah. They did that once when the Shah escaped, and USA then suppressed the rebellion and he was brought back. But this time he was too old, and so the same could not be done. And at the same time, the popular movement was too strong this time. As a result, the United States was able to successfully, or rather, like United States, while in the past has been able to successfully overthrow popular governments, or was able to repress the popular will of the Iranian people, was no longer able, they were no longer able to control the revolution, and the Shah was eventually successfully overthrown. The person leading the revolution was an 80 plus year old Islamic cleric by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini. What Khomeini was able to achieve in 1979 uh, was known as the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Uh, the country changed overnight because the government became So before the revolution, uh, Khomeini had promised that he is going to establish a new government which is ruled by the Iranian people, and then he would step aside. But after he came to power, he held a referendum on whether Iran should become an Islamic republic or not. And overwhelmed by the success of the revolution, people voted to sorry, people voted for Iran to become an Islamic Republic, and as a result, Khomeini made himself the supreme leader of Iran. So the way Iranian government works, so unlike the previous government, so far we have seen a capitalistic society, we have seen a pseudo-communist totalitarian rule. We have seen an authoritarian dictatorship of Vladimir Putin. We have seen a monarchy, which is Saudi Arabia. So this government is a theocracy, which means that it is primarily ruled by Islamic clerics. Unlike most of the Islamic world, the Iranian population is 95% Shia, which means unlike others which are Sunni. So because they are Shia, and their interests clashed with Saudi Arabia. This eventually became a Shia-Sunni split as well. But that's a different story altogether. So coming back to Khomeini, uh, as a result, the Iranian government has broadly uh, three important elements. The first is the supreme leader and the government. Uh, just one sec. Hello. I should think anything's been going on. I'll call you back. Yeah, yeah, you can watch the live stream. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, so unlike the rest of the population, Iran broadly had a Shia majority. Oh, so why did Shia Sunni wars come about? It broadly came about because of Iran's conflicts with its neighbors, and because Iran also happened to be Shia, it became a Shia Sunni split as well. But for now, let's just focus on internal history that Iran had and why its government was formed the way it was. So because Iran has a supreme leader and a government, at the same time, Iran has a clergy of clerics, and Iran has a military which is called the Revolutionary Guards. So Iranian regime's power comes from the clergy and the Revolutionary Guards, from whom they draw legitimacy. Iran's poverty rate today is 30%, so clearly they haven't improved economically. But at the same time, they have posed a strong geopolitical challenge to the American influence during the previous years. The reason behind that is people have an entrenched hatred for the United States given the years of suppression of popular opinion, and changing that mindset over time is incredibly difficult. However, at the same time, the regime itself has also failed to deliver on the promises that they had made in terms of the emancipation that they would draw. As a result, the regime has also suffered widespread protests against the revolution, and the Revolutionary Guards have repressed them over time. And this means that there's a significant unpopularity that the regime suffers from in Iran, but at the same time, their legitimacy from the Revolutionary Guards and from the clergy continues to remain, which can be argued is ironic because the reason why Shah was overthrown was also because the government was unresponsive to the wills of the people, and because the Shah's police used to torture and repress the people at the bottom, and that appears to not have changed very significantly under the supreme leader. Another important, interesting thing to note is that the current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, has a net worth or the amount of wealth which is roughly equivalent in real terms to what the Shah had shortly before being overthrown. So yeah, this Iranian revolution in many ways has led to a situation today which is fairly ironic in nature. So how does Iranian government export the revolution to other places? So Iran broadly has a viewpoint that all the other regions should also align itself to Iran because of the revolution that they encountered. So, in its bid to become the leader of the Muslim world, they have funded militias across the Middle East to surround countries like Saudi Arabia. And I'll send the link to the Vox video from which I received, from which I was able to best frame this. Uh, so, a few examples of this. In Lebanon is a country right above Israel. And when Israel invaded Lebanon, Iran funded militias in Lebanon, which were able to successfully oust the United States and Israel from that country. This militia is called Hezbollah, and they continue to remain a powerful influence in Lebanon. They have funded a number of militias in Iraq who eventually also became strong political parties and contested elections. So you have Iranian backed regimes in places like Iraq. They sent militias against the rebels and to support Bashar al-Assad, and they are also funding the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And if you remember from the previous part of my workshop, Saudi Arabia is funding the government of Yemen, whereas Iran is funding the rebels in Yemen against the government. An opposite situation is taking place in Syria, or like was taking place in Syria, where Saudi Arabia was supporting the rebels in Syria, while Iran was supporting the Syrian government. So, in many ways, it's similar to what happened during the Cold War, except it's just happening in the Middle East. And Iran has been involved in that. So Iran does this through a very complex web of Iranian militia, and those militia were created and like nurtured to a strong extent by a man called Qasim Soleimani, whom United States recently executed. Because of which Iran does appear to have lost significant influence in that region, but the network continues to exist. So, how much was Iran hurt really depends, is something that we are yet to find out. But in a historical chronology, yeah, Iran has been pretty. Iran has lost significant influence. Beyond that, Iran's politics, just like USA, has also been differing across time. So you have two kinds of people in there. The first are the moderates. Moderates who are prefer developing friendlier ties with the United States, just like you have the internationalists in the United States, and you have hardliners who support boycotting United States and keeping Iran isolated and preserving the revolution. I think it's the moderates who won out when the current president of Iran was elected. The Iranian president, which is Hassan Rouhani, was elected on a moderate platform against Ibrahim Raisi, who was a hardliner. So this moderate hardliner elections continue to happen. Before Rouhani, the president was Ahmadinejad, and his hardline regime was extremely unpopular among the public, as a result of which Rouhani was eventually elected. The supreme leader of Iran, who can dismiss prime ministers at his own will, generally approves all the policies that the prime minister makes. So, the prime minister's policies often serve as an indicator of what the public sentiment is. So, that assessment helps the supreme leader keep himself in power. So, the supreme leader, uh, while is a hardliner, has been tolerant to moderate policies. For example, Iran nuclear deal happening. However, at the same time, ever since the Iran nuclear deal was torn apart, even Rouhani has broadly become a hardliner, and Iran has become increasingly apathetic. But because of the economic constraints that the regime today faces, they have still not responded significantly to the killing of Qasim Soleimani, which indicates a fundamental change in the Iranian regime, which does want to preserve itself. And to preserve itself, it has to ensure uh, a certain degree of prosperity reaching its people. So yeah, that's broadly the context of Iran. And just to summarize, Iran, it is it has a history of people being repressed by American actions, including its own democratically elected president. It has a democracy in the sense that it elects a prime minister, and the prime minister gives the supreme leader an indication of what the public sentiment is. The supreme leader, who is appointed primarily by the clergy, is in fact he has a last say on every policy that Iran makes, but he has been tolerant to moderate as well as hardline views depending on who the prime minister was. And today, Iran faces an economic crisis because of American sanctions and also because Iranian regime is extremely unpopular. Why? Because majority of Iranian resources often end up going to the revolutionary guards and the clergy as opposed to the common people, because Iran, as a result, Iran is still poor. If we compare that to the autocratic regime in China, which was able to emancipate billions of people from within a span of a few decades, that is 66% in 1990 to around 4% in 2017, uh, we can see the stark difference between the priorities of the two regimes and the methods that the two regimes use to remain popular and legitimate. In one case, it is the revolutionary guards and the clergy. In the China's case, it is good economic policies meant for emancipation. Any questions uh, in this? Okay. So the reason why I gave you this 1.5 hour long context of various countries is because in when you're framing debating arguments, there are two things that you need to factor in whenever you use these things in a debate. So I'm just moving on to a brief about how you should be carrying out an IR debate and how all of these contexts, the government, the economy, the politics, and the military plays an important role. Did the Shia Sunni split cause it, or was it just a justification for the war? Or it was not a justification for the war, but the war caused a Shia Sunni split. So the war he's talking about is when Iran was just formed. Uh, Saddam Hussein result, it eventually ended into a ceasefire with no side actually winning, and chemical weapons were also used. Uh, but all of these conflicts and everything that Iran has done has now been to further the Shia cause, while Saudi Arabia and the other countries oppose it and further the Sunni cause. But it started because of geopolitics and not because of some inherent difference existing between them. And it's not a war per se, but it's more like a cold war between the two countries. Finally, uh, yeah, any other questions? Okay, just to repeat, oh, is the buffering gone now, Amok? Okay, perfect. So, so let's okay. So just a summary of the war part of it. Uh, so when Iran was just formed, Saddam Hussein that he started losing the war, and they were pushed back to Iran-Iraq border as a result. And this war is somewhere in the 19 or somewhere in the 1980s. And this war caused like millions of casualties on both sides, hurt Iranian economy, and kept it pretty bad. So it was also not fair for Iran to really show, Iran for to really show its own strength to further the Iranian cause. Uh, because I think a ceasefire at that stage would have prevented millions of deaths when the offer was made. But anyway, the war dragged on for almost 6 years after the first ceasefire was offered. And then with other countries also funding Iraq, gradually it just drew to a stalemate, and Iran just halted it as a ceasefire. Uh, why did Khomeini finally decide that the ceasefire should be conducted? Is because despite his strong desire to carry on and press on with the conflict, he realized that it will hurt the Iranian public's interest and the interest of the revolution for the war to drag on. So, what he called the poisoned chalice of ceasefire is something he took. The reason why the poisoned chalice is very important is because Khomeini is really revered in the Iranian culture, and uh, the only way that the Iranian government today has is able to back down from a conflict with the United States, despite USA killing Qasim Soleimani, is by drawing from the legacy of Ruhollah Khomeini and saying that they are also taking a poisoned chalice uh, of ceasefire against the United States and not the base they are targeting. So that base was evacuated, and then they fired weapons to down that military base, and they also accidentally drowned down another passenger airline, and which really made the government even more unpopular at home, and more protests started against the government. So that's broadly the context under which Iran is existing at present. Now, how do we use these things in debates? In debates, you will be expected to act in a particular manner, or to make sure countries be expected to act in a particular manner that serves their interest. So you should factor in two things when it comes to international relations in debates. The first is the internal dynamics inside any country, which means that, for example, if the motion, this was NUJS Octo Finals, the motion was United States should actively actively assert its authority over the Arctic region in view of growing Russian influence. So when we are talking about why the United States is doing this, it is important, one, to talk about, of course, USA externally, which means how USA interacts with other countries and how geopolitically doing this is going to give USA more influence. But it's also important to understand how it affects USA internally, which means that USA is a democratic system. People on the ground are electing their representatives. The current representative is Donald Trump. And why is it that the people, but he was elected, but at the same time, there was also Russian meddling in the American elections. So the arguments which can be made are things like people in the United States don't want to spend so much on the military, or the Democratic Party has won the House of Representatives, and the people over there don't want their day-to-day lives disrupted, or they don't want conscription to come again, which means that they don't want that degree of war. And the fact that Donald Trump, who is an isolationist, came to power means that United States being involved in external conflicts is not something that United States really wanted. So, to that extent, an opposition case can then be made around why the people of USA wouldn't want their government to do this in the first place. That's the internal dynamics. External dynamics are how United States would be hurt if it involves itself in a conflict by becoming unpopular among the nations around that place and imposing itself against Russia and Russian retaliation. So both of these dynamics become significantly important. So in the meantime, again from the government, you can drive it on two lines. One is the external line, which means furthering American interests against the Russians, and the resources that come over there, the fact that Arctic area is melting, and that creates new trade routes in the north, and USA wants control over them. But it can also be argued internally, which means that people perceive Russia as a threat to their day-to-day lives, and that they will be supporting such an action which will be curbing Russian military actions in the future, because Russia is extremely unpopular in the American voter base. So these two dynamics, which are one internal and second external, are really important. Same with the idea, with any motion which involves China, right? For example, should like For example, should the United States sanction China, or should the USA enter into a trade war with China? So there are external arguments. Time, if you look at China itself, then you have sufficient arguments there as well. So the Chinese economy being extremely vulnerable, fragile, being export dependent, the people of China being the primary objective of Chinese policy being the people of China being sufficiently happy, and their happiness depends on how much economic resources are available to them. And in an export dependent economy, when Chinese indigenous companies lose their market, uh, the people on ground will be unhappy, and the party doesn't want that. So an understanding of how a country works from the inside will help you to predict how a country is going to behave from outside. Similarly, when China imposed tariffs on the United States, they didn't just try to hurt the United States of America. They tried to hurt Trump directly by only imposing tariffs on products which come from which come from regions which are Trump's core voter base. So that's an example of having a good understanding of the internal dynamics of a country based on their political system and based on their history to really choose the right course of action to make. Same goes with whether China should pursue, whether China should quash dissent in Hong Kong, or should they take any military action in Hong Kong. Or the arguments in favor of it is how it can inspire like the uh, other suppressed people, for example, the Tibetans, the rebels in Xinjiang, to raise arms against the Chinese, and that hurts the party image. It can also be argued externally, and the image of Chinese stability eventually vanishing, which is one of the reasons why people really come to China in the first place, which is a strong authoritarian regime that does not tolerate dissent, is more likely to protect me as compared to a feeble or like a flippant ally such as the United States is. So these are examples of understanding the internal mechanisms in their respective country. Uh, okay, a few questions here. Doesn't overthrowing the democracy in Iran go against neoconservatism as well as internationalism? Oh, no, it goes against neoconservatism, but this was the internationalist phase in the United States foreign policy. What that means is that the act of overthrowing uh, Mossadegh and installing a US friendly dictator was in the interest of sorry was in the interest of the American allies, which is the NATO. So USA acted in the in the interest of the world order to prevent the spread of communism in those areas, or suspected spread of communism. Uh, Neoconservatism supports democracy, and no, internationalism stands for American influence or intervention in other areas, uh, generally peaceful, but at the same time also fending off threats which can be violent potentially. For example, uh, letting so the rationale that United States has was the war against communism broadly. So the justification was instilling a fear of communism in the name of containment. So this comes under the broad US policy of containing the spread of communism in these kinds of countries. So that was the rationale behind not just installing so they have supported any dictator. I forget the name of the dictator, but the dictator of South Korea, and all of these were dictators. They also installed Augusto Pinochet in Chile after the coup, where they killed the democratically elected socialist president of Chile. So in all these instances, the justification was containment of socialism or communism, which was practically the same at that point. Is that a legitimate justification? Not really. It was mostly serving American geopolitical interests, but broadly, the justification still was containment. So that is there. Fair enough. So, coming to how do you frame all of these arguments and how do you use them strategically in debates? First, what you need to know a few things about any country when it comes to international relations. I'll just see if I have it written somewhere, but I think I don't, so I'll just say it. Oh, here it is. Yeah. So a few things that you need to know in the context of uh, containing communism, so that there are more markets to trade with, right? Or sometimes just because containing communism is popular. So if you go into internally how United States works, the government has an incentive to stay popular with the public, and if they are seen as people containing communism, then that's a good thing. Of course, there are trade benefits as well, but primarily the benefit was to curb Soviet Union's geopolitical influence. So whenever you're arguing on an IR motion, uh, generally try to describe the actions of a nation in the context of the internal dynamics of the country, and why is it that it is better for the country or for whoever is taking that decision. For example, Russia exploring the Arctic is to get hold of more resources like coal, etc., which will then be used to provide resources to the Russian economy because they'll be exporting that coal. And that resources Russian economy creates more jobs, more people have money. So Russia's economic condition improves and the social unrest goes down. And that's what Putin wants in order to keep himself popular because people won't be happy with him if they are starving. So that's broadly how you judge actions based on internally how countries function. Externally, uh, for example, this house supports when Chinese artifacts which are being stolen, assuming that China is doing it, this house supports the actions of the Chinese government. So uh, here, not only do you need to argue why these actions are benefiting the China at large, but you need to argue it in view of the government and the public being two distinct entities, which means that uh, if you support this particular action, the fact that China is reclaiming it is not a benefit unless you show that public is getting access to it. Because if the government is simply stealing it, it makes no difference per se on the ground level. So one, don't treat the country as a monolith, but rather treat it as diverse set of individuals with their own interests in a larger ecosystem that is out there. So that's the first thing. Secondly, uh, think about the rational interests that countries have generally. So generally, humanitarian interests are rare. So try and find a geopolitical interest that serves all the members or at least the powerful members of a country. For example, signing trade deals helps enrich the Saudi monarchy because they want to lead that lavish lifestyle and get an upper end over the clerical system that exists. Or Iran wants Iran's government wants the people to be satisfied with it and to quell the protests or like to satisfy the people on the ground. They signed the Iran nuclear deal because that allows Iran some breathing space and allows it to enrich its people and to enrich its revolutionary guards and clerics. So that's the interest that Iran has. So it's not Iran per se, but rather the people of Iran, the government of Iran, the clergy of Iran, and the revolutionary guards of Iran. And since all of them are benefited by the Iran nuclear deal, is the reason why the Iranian government is taking this decision. Same with the Belt and Road Initiative. It makes the party really powerful and it gives the party supported firms access to foreign markets. So think of it in terms of actors inside that country that determine international relations at large. I think that will help you to focus the debate a lot better. And the context of all of these nations was important to give you an idea of how the internal functioning of these countries has influenced their geopolitics over time. So make use of that. Although I'll still try and share some resources uh, associated with this. So so uh, before I close this workshop, because I think I've spent a good amount of time now on this, any further questions that you have? So I'll just summarize what we have done in the entire workshop very briefly. So in the meantime, you guys can post whatever questions you have for this workshop. So first, we looked at things like the hegemonic stability theory and what are the factors that determine international relations. We spoke about economic factors, geopolitical. Uh, uh, just a sec, if I'm missing out on anything. Yeah, so economic, military, political, cultural, ideological, also other factors like historical today. So first, the United States with their capitalistic system, their relevance in the economy or in the world economy, as well as their military might, makes them the undisputed leader of the free world today. Then we spoke about China and how their economic might is really powerful, even though they have been very passive, makes China unique in the sense that it's an economic superpower. Uh, then we moved on to Russia, for which the military was the most relevant because the dictator is craving for. Then we spoke about Saudi Arabia, where the legitimacy of the clergy and the legitimacy from the army was the most important part, and also the fact that Saudi Arabia is the leader of the Islamic world. As a result, the monarchy is dependent on all of these institutions, although that trend is recently changing. Uh, then we went to Iran and how they have funded and tried to spread the revolution across the Middle East, how they are funding different militias to surround countries like Saudi Arabia, and how they have been reasonably successful in doing so. But they've also made themselves very unpopular among the public in the process. The Shia clergy and the revolutionary guards are also unpopular, but at the same time, they are also the ones who give legitimacy to the regime, and they have been able to strike that balance. But the protests against the Iranian government continue to happen, and with coronavirus, the government's uh, clumsiness has become increasingly prominent in this context. Finally, we spoke about how IR needs to be debated. The way you debate it is one, of course, the context is the main part of it. And then you think about how the countries work internally. You look at various players inside each country, like the ones we just mentioned, see how each of their players are benefited as a result of the action taken by states aggressively asserts itself. Will Russia escalate it? Because so one could argue that Russia will has historically escalated itself. Putin wants to project more strength, so he's very likely to escalate the conflict because he can't be seen as backing down, which might lead to a conflict taking place in the Arctic. You can also oppose this idea by arguing that uh, by escalating the conflict, Russia is sure to lose, which means that you cannot quite do this at a time when you're already overstretched and your resources are already undermined and you're already occupied in multiple places. And so Russia would rather be more willing to back down and be open to like signing trade agreements as opposed to direct conflict in this context. Uh, So all of these factors need to be very well understood to make sure that all the players in this, so in this case, Putin, the Russian people, the Russian military, at the same time, the American people, the American representatives are all benefited, is the best course of action to take. Or you need to show that a course of action is going to be in the best interests of the most important players inside any country to make sure that that country will pursue only that course of action. So Russia will not escalate a conflict in the Arctic because so that's broadly how you should be debating an IR motion. And do we? Okay, now let's just go to a few questions. If a country manipulates the patriotism of its citizen, how do we argue about that? Uh, One, countries do manipulate patriotism of their citizen, as we have already seen happen in countries like the United States, like Russia, occasionally in India. Uh, the manipulation of patriotism, uh, how do you argue about that? One, acknowledge that there are different viewpoints even within your country. So in United States, you have multiple people who are more pacifist, who are more internationalist, and you have multiple people who are patriotic. So there is always a spectrum of people inside your country who want different things. Uh, but if they're already brainwashed into believing that nation's interests should come first, and if you want to argue against something of this sort, then it's better not to address a problem which cannot be solved. So If the Russian people have no other way of getting information, then you could argue that that exists, although that is not the case. You also have an opposition in Russia and the social media through which people like Alexei Navalny have been protesting against the Russian government. Uh, so you can always argue about dissent existing within a population or during the course of any action that you're taking. Do we talk about what people would really want or the patriotism being induced in the people? So you can talk about both. So you can talk about how better economic conditions can make people happy. You can also talk about why people care more about patriotism because they have been brainwashed. And both of these are very legitimate lines of characterization to take. So the side that characterizes this better is more likely to take the debate than the other side. So both these characterizations can be argued pretty well. Are IR motions supposed to have more consequential grounding of the principle than other themes? Also, how important is talking about implementation challenges in IR? Implementation is primarily central to IR motions in general. Why? Because in IR, it's always about proving that these actions are going to benefit your people. So if you don't prove the implementation part of it, then you can't really get anywhere. So for example, this house will invade Zimbabwe. If you don't prove that the invasion will be successful, or if you're not, then like there's no point of proving like that Zimbabwe will be invaded, unless there are some very specific principled motions. Then in those motions, IR principles become more important. But even if it was this house believes that Zimbabwe should be invaded, uh, the debate will naturally go in the direction of whether Zimbabwe should be invaded, whether the invasion will be successful. I think all of these still become a very important part of it. So, one, IR motions will generally be will motions, but secondly, even if they aren't, showing implementation will generally make your case significantly stronger as compared to the alternatives. So, yeah, IR motions, your arguments would generally be more consequential. And the way you can show consequence is through various characterizations of all the players inside every political entity. But if you don't have a clear idea of how the political system works, uh, how do you ground the fact that patriotism makes people happy? Oh, you don't. So the way you ground that is uh, things like importance of self-image, or importance of seeing your country win, the prestige that comes with it. For example, we all want India to win in a cricket match, even though we aren't physically gaining anything out of it, or the number of people who cheer when like India conducted the strikes against Pakistan, uh, in Uri strikes against Pakistan. So seeing yourself uh, in that country and the fact that you make yourself a part of the nation state means that there's a certain degree of solidarity that the country has in itself. So that backed up with examples like these is good enough to prove that patriotism is a very strong driving force, coupled with jingoistic media that exists in countries like Russia uh, or in countries like China means that uh, these things can very easily be constructed in the minds of the people, and this brainwashing can happen very successfully. So you can argue, why do people care about making America great? Or is it simply because the way America is projecting itself outside is something that matters a lot to them? Because the image of America was a lot stronger for them, and the image of the United States was something that they were quite happy about, the rather the way in which it is being thrown. So yeah, that's how patriotism gets constructed in the minds of the people, and the governments then try to satisfy that need by projecting themselves. Any other questions before we wrap up? So I'll wait for one more minute. Okay. So I thank all the people who were a part of this workshop, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't discuss international organizations like IMF and the European Union. But I also thank you for being a part of this throughout. Uh, you can connect with me either on PM or just message on the group as well. Also, I'll try and share resources which I have. I think I've already shared some with Kshitij. So I think that should be enough. But in case there is more, like I'll definitely add to it. Also, there is an IR repository which we created 1 year back, and I think that it's titled "The Problem of Introductions." So I think, in fact, this workshop was meant to address the problem by introducing you to the basics. So I think that is something that will be really helpful for you. So thank you so much, guys, for being a part of it. And if this, and you can keep this video on YouTube itself. So in case people want to refer to this workshop in the future, feel free to do so. In some cases, my facts weren't perfectly accurate. In that case, you can always just let me know. I'll be happy to make any corrections to things I said. Uh, in case things like military funding numbers and like the poverty rates and stuff which I mentioned. These are things that I just generally knew, so you can always tell me if there are any corrections to this as well. I'll try and share the uh, structure of Chinese economy. I think I already shared a PDF about this on the group itself, so you can take a look at that. It's an excerpt from Raghuram Rajan's Third Pillar, uh, which is a book I strongly encourage you guys to read. It's just a small excerpt derived from there. Also, there are there is a report by UN. There's a UN development report, so I'll also see if I can find that on my PC, and in case I find it, I'll share it with you guys. That's about how countries emancipated themselves. So thank you so much, guys, for attending. Uh, just have fun, and like I think you guys are also going to prep now. So good luck with your case preps as well, and let's connect next time in any other future prep slash workshops.